I spent quite a bit of time studying Heaney's poetry, and some of my poems were heavily influenced by Heaney's poems. The first poem I'm going to read is a sonnet, and maybe you can hear echoes of Heaney in the sonnet. I wrote it near the beginning of my poetry writing career, and it's partly about beginning as a poet, beginning with a lot of enthusiasm for poetry, writing poetry, but I must admit early on, maybe this is a general experience, I was kind of mystified by poetry and how to do it, how to write poetry. Maybe in the end, writing poetry is a mystery. So in this poem, I compare making poems to something else that mystified me when I was growing up, and that was the making of maple syrup. I grew up in New England. You'll see I'll read some poems about growing up on a Christmas tree farm, but just up the road from where I lived, there was a SAP House, and we had an older neighbor who made the maple syrup inside the SAP House. I would collect the buckets of sap from the maple trees, and I would cut wood, split wood, and provide the wood for the fires. And occasionally I would sort of peek in the window at what this neighbor was doing. I never really figured out what he was doing. So it was a bit of a mystery, just like writing poetry early on. So this poem is called The SAP House. I never knew how it was done inside. When the truck parked, we drilled holes in maples, tamped metal spigots to catch the flow. Each week we drove through woods, tipping buckets lidded with ice into the truck bed's tub. Inside the red shack, a shadow, half green, half mist, leaned into sweet steam and wood smoke, dipping the ladle, touching the scoop to his tongue. It was all a mystery. The sap crossed through the vat's steel baffles. It dripped heavy with sugar into the final barrel. I wanted to taste the pure elixir, the oracle spelling itself out in mist, the juice stinging my tongue like flame. I also listened to a lot of Dylan Thomas's poetry when I was younger. I thought he was like an angel orating with a tongue of flame. I wanted to have that poetic tongue of flame. In order to write poetry, you know, it's good to have a guide, a teacher, a mentor early on. My first writing teacher and mentor was my grandfather. My parents were much more science-oriented. They were always telling me when I come home from college, stop taking those poetry courses, you're never going to get a job. But my grandfather had been an English major. He was a freelance writer, journalist, but he also wrote short stories, poems. He had spent a lot of time in China, so he would translate Chinese poems into English. He wrote plays. He was always encouraging me to write, and I would send him my first attempts, which were terrible, but he was always very kind, very supportive. So the next poem is a kind of tribute to my grandfather. He tried to pass on the gift of writing to me. In this poem, I'm giving him a gift to say thanks for all of your help. It's set in his studio. I was very intrigued as a boy by his studio. He had bought an old ice house. He also lived in New England and converted it into his writing studio. And day after day, he'd be in his ice house tapping away at a very ancient manual typewriter called a Royal typewriter. Today, probably only seen them on Antique Roadshow or something. The poem begins in a workshop in our barn where I'm making a mobile of birds. And the birds are warblers, if you know anything about birds. Beautiful, colorful little birds. And I mention the artist Alexander Calder because he made mobiles, but also he had a studio quite close to my grandfather's house. So this poem is called A Gift of Warblers. It begins in the barn where I'm making the warblers. The old barn's storeroom was a humid square. Wasps hissed from clumps of mud. Honeyless combs hung from beams as hornets spun their cyclones in the eaves. All summer, the brown box radio stammered news of circling storms. Heat popped the water jug's cap, warped windows shut, drew odors of cows from the original chestnut. On cool nights, I penciled warblers around knots on plywood slabs. The hand jigsaw raised a burr along the lines. Sawdust clung to hair like dampened fur. With a camel hair brush dipped in paint, I stroked the wood to olive crests, black face masks, yellow breasts, orange bibs, white wing stripes, and dust blue backs. Glued to strings on a lilac branch, they were Calder cutouts, lilting as I puffed their feathers into flight. For years they hung in my grandfather's ice house studio, his typewriter below, clicking through summers like ice picks on blocks once stacked in sawdust where he sat. Today, mold drifts like snow under the ice house beams, ragweed scatters seeds across its tilting steps, cedar shingles split by lichen powder at the touch. The gift still hangs over the black skeleton of his royal type. I brush the gray wings and salt white tails. They turn towards me as once they turned towards him as he hummed the names, Blackburnian, Magnolia, Myrtle, Cape May, Cerulean, Black and White. So those are all names of warblers at the end.